Hello, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of the UiPath Apps to Data Service Integration video series. My name is Andy Menon. In this video, we are going to be talking about the static list control. The form that you see on this screen was covered during the part 1 of this video series. Therefore, I highly recommend that you watch the part 1 video before you proceed. So what is a static list control? A static list control is a drop-down list that is populated with a fixed set of values. And those fixed set of values will most likely not change over the lifetime of the application. If you look at the control palette in the UiPath Apps Studio, you can see this static list control known as a drop-down list. And because you're populating a drop-down list with static values, I'm going to refer to this control as either a static list control or a drop-down list. I have here a list of fixed values that I'm going to be working with in this video. So let's convert this set of values into a static list by using the UiPath apps list function. And the conversion is pretty simple. I have taken these values and I have enclosed them in quotes and separated them out with commas. And all I have to do is surround them with brackets and use the list function. And this is pretty much what we'll be doing to populate the drop-down list with this fixed set of values. So I'm going to copy this entire set of values, go back to App Studio. If you have observed, there is an error related to this control here, and that is because I've rolled back some of the changes. So I begin by clicking into the list source property, and I'll invoke the list function. Open brackets. I copy the entire set of values and close brackets. So as you can see, the error has disappeared. Let us save the changes. So before I preview the application here again, you can see that there's a completely different set of values here. So once I preview the new changes, I should be able to see my new values in this control. So I'm going to close this out, go back and preview. Okay. So good. We have the list of values that I intended to populate into this drop-down list. But there's a problem. Usually, a drop-down list has a default value that is selected, and this default value can either be a prompt or it can be one of the data values that's selected by default. But we do not see that here. So let's go back and fix that. If you look at the properties of the drop-down list and scroll down, there is a property named default selected value. So if I go back to the list of my static values, this is the value that I'll be using as the default. So I'm going to copy this, go back to default selected value equals, open double quotes, close double quotes, save, we'll close this out, preview. And this time you see that the default value has been populated and it is already pre-selected when the form renders on the screen. So good. Next, what do we do? if the user selects a value from this list and changes the selected value in the dropdown. Where are we going to record this? For that, let's go back to the App Studio and going back to the properties of the dropdown. There is a property named selected value binding. So what happens is when you select a value or when the user selects a value from the dropdown, it is going to be populated into a variable. And that variable will be used downstream by the UiPath app to perform the process that it is designed to do. So for that, what we'll be doing is we'll be binding the selected value binding property with an app variable. So I invoke the resources tab, go down to the app variable section. I've already created a variable named var list static selected. If you haven't already created a variable, then you click the plus sign here and create a variable on the fly. So since I've already created one, I'm going to double click. And that's pretty much how you capture the value selected by the user into a variable that you can then use further downstream in your UiPath app. Okay, this is good, but I see a problem here when it comes to the overall design approach of building the static list control. If I go back to the App Studio and look at how this control has been built, straight away I can see a problem. And the problem is these static list of values have been hard coded here directly into this control. Now, in my opinion, that's not a very good practice. There are several reasons for it. First, it is possible that you are going to be using this static list of values in more than one place in an application. And if that's going to be the case, then putting these fixed set of values here will mean that you will have to do the same work elsewhere in a different page or a different form of your UiPath app. And that's going to be repeating your code multiple times or duplicating your code multiple times in that app. And if those values must change, then you have to track down every single instance of where you have used these fixed set of values and change them. And if you forget to change them in one place, then your changes will not be completely valid. So that's the first problem. The second problem is if you go back to the list and watch the list in action, today I have this value here as the default selected value. And I have hard coded that value in the default selected value property. But what if the conditions of your application changes tomorrow and you would want to have, let's say, UiPath RPA as the default selected value everywhere in your application? In which case, you're going to have two problems. One, you'll have to come back here and change this. And if you've used the static list in multiple interfaces across your UiPath app, you have to go and track those changes and change that default selected value in all the locations in your application. So this is going to be, in the long term, a maintenance problem. Besides, it is never a good practice to hard code something when you're building an enterprise grade application. Even if you're using this list control in one place, it is never a good habit, because tomorrow, for any reason, you delete this control, you lose these values. Therefore, it's important that you relocate this static list of values and also the default selected value somewhere else in the application so that it is not lost or it's not adversely impacted should you delete this control in the future. So how do we tackle these two problems? So the first thing that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to wipe out this entire list source static or hard-coded binding. And instead, what I'm going to do is bind it to another variable I've created. And the name of that variable is var list static. So double click and I'm going to go down, wipe out this hard-coded value in the default selected value and go back to the apps section and bind this property to an other variable called var list static underscore default. So what you see here is that I have used a minimum of 3 app variables to build my static list control. So let me save these changes and hit preview. There is nothing. So something is wrong. So let's go back and fix that. So the problem here is we have populated this list source with a variable called var list static. But we really haven't focused on what this variable is and what is the value or what are the values assigned to this var list static variable. Basically, what we have to be doing is if we are going to be binding this static list control to a variable, that variable has to be populated with the predefined fixed set of values that we saw earlier. So going back to Notepad, I have to set var list static equal to the list of all the predefined values that you see here. So where are we going to do that? There are two ways you can populate this variable, the var list static variable, when it comes to building a static list control. The first way is to go to the form, the parent form. In this case, the static list control is in the form named page demo1 form validation, and this is the parent form. And if we go to the events and we edit the loaded event, I've already set up 2 steps. And if I enable this step here, you can see that I have set the var list static to a list of values. So this is one way of populating this static list variable. So if I close this out and then preview the app again, observe that there are no values here now. So I'm going to close this out. And if I preview once more, so on the surface, it looks good. But if you observe, the default pre-selected value has disappeared. So what's wrong and how do we fix that? So going back to the app designer, we click on this form, go back to the onloaded event and edit that rule once again. What I have done here is I have replaced the first value with another variable named var list static default. Remember that this variable is the same variable that has been actually bound to the default selected value property of the static list control. So just like the var list static variable, we haven't really populated this variable, the var list static default variable, with an initial value. So again, going back to the form and editing the loaded event, I'm going to enable this step here. And this time I'm going to change the default value to something completely different and save my changes. So no default value here. Close this out, preview. So good. This time we see the new default value along with the predefined list of data values populated, and the default value has been pre-selected when the form loads. So this is great. So what we have done here is we have moved the entire action of populating the static list control and also setting its default selected value into a completely different location instead of hard coding it in or hard coding it directly in the static list control. This is good, but we can make this even better. In this approach, we have populated the app variables in the loaded event of this local form here. But that is going to solve the problem just for this form. But what happens if you want to use the same set of values in another drop-down list on another form in the same app? In which case, this solution is not going to help because you will have to populate or set the values of these two variables at a higher scope. And that higher scope is the application scope. And when we talk about the application scope, we go back to the main page. And just like the local form page has a loaded event, the main page also has a loaded event. And within that loaded event, you write all the rules that are required to be run when that app is initially loaded. So let me go back to the local form and edit this rule again and disable these two steps. I'm going to undo the changes that I just showed you in the previous steps, and I'm going to close this out. And I'm going to move over to the main page of the form, and under the events, edit the rule under the loaded event. And I have two steps here that are pretty much similar to the one that I showed you. So I'm going to enable this step here and also enable the second step. Now, just to make this point very clear, I have actually set the values of the list static default to a completely different value, but let me change it here again. And again, to make this point very clear, I'm going to change this set of values to something different. Save my changes, preview. And here you can see that the drop-down list has been populated with an entirely different set of values. And those set of values came from the loaded event of the main page. So what is the point I'm trying to make here? There are several advantages to building your static list control this way. So the first advantage is that The static list control variables, the var list static and the var list static default, are populated once during the entire life of the application. What that means is you don't have to populate these variables again and again each time you invoke a static list control in one or more forms in your app. The second advantage is the entire process of populating these values is concentrated in one place. So you change it in one place, it changes in all your forms throughout your app. And third, tracking these changes in the future is going to become a lot more easier than it is to track the very same changes at the local form level. So these are the main advantages of loading the static list control in the loaded event of the main page, as opposed to loading them when each form is loaded on the screen. And so that is pretty much it when it comes to building a static list control in your UiPath apps. Okay, so now we are going to cover how to validate the inputs to the static list control when the user selects a value from the fixed set of values here in the static list. As we all know, most likely the default selected value is not a data value. So this particular default value has no meaning unless I change that to something else, which makes more sense. Now there is a label control here. It is largely static. You see, it does not change. And we are going to be now associating this control to report on the validation of the selections made by the user in this static list control. Before I begin, I just wanted to let you know that I have gone back to the main page into the load event, and I have rolled back the changes that I made in the previous section, and I have brought back the values that I'm going to be working with. And you can see that the var list static has been populated with this default of my choice and also the fixed values of my choice. So I have already made those changes and saved them. And that is why you're seeing this static list populated the way it is. Okay, so we're going to switch back to the local form that contains this list control. And I have this label here, and this label has been named cap static list. And the rule that we are going to impose for the validation is the label control must be visible if the selection, the current selected value in the static list is equal to the default value. And if the currently selected value is not equal to the default value, then this label must be hidden. So from the previous section, we know that we have three variables associated with the list control, and we'll be working with the static, the var list static selected and the var list static default. And along with that, we'll be using the if function to write the validation rule. And I'm going to click on this label, and we'll be manipulating the hidden attribute of the label control and write a function that will control the hidden property of this caption. Hidden equals if var list static selected not equal to var list static default, comma. Now, if this condition is true, if the selected value or the value selected by the user is not equal to the default value, then the control must remain hidden, in which case hidden must be true. So I'm going to put in true. But if the selected value is still equal to the default value, or whenever the user changes it back to the default value, then hidden must be false. So false, close bracket. You can simply turn the condition on its head and write it this way. If var list static selected equals var list static default, then hidden must be false, else hidden must be true. I'm going to go with this selection because this makes a lot of sense to me. So we'll be coding this expression for that label control. So switching back, label control, going to the hidden property, I'll remove the default and invoke the if function. If, open bracket, var list selected not equal to var list default, comma, true, else false, close. Save. So from the current version of the application, you can see that this control is not reactive at all. There is no reaction from this control whatsoever. So we'll close this out and preview the changes. This is correct because the selected value equals the default value. This is the expected result when the form loads. I'm going to alter the selection now, and it's gone. And when I switch back to the default value, the label is back. So this is how we validate the input of the user from the static list control before we move on to the form submission process. Okay, before we proceed with this section, I would highly recommend that you watch the last section of the part 1 video of this video series, because in the previous video, we had associated the validation results of these two fields with the disabled behavior of the form button. If you observe here, the save button is disabled, and if I enter valid data into these two fields, the form button is enabled, but the static list control still has an invalid value. And we want the form button, the save button rather, to remain disabled if one or more of these validation captions are visible on the screen. So again, the condition to regulate the disabled behavior of the save button was built in the last section of the part 1 video, and I would highly encourage you to watch it before proceeding with this section. I've already clicked the save button, and you can see that the disabled feature has an expression attached to it. It uses the and not function, and also the resolvable hidden attributes of these two labels. Simply put, the save button will remain disabled if one or more of these caption controls are going to be visible. And this time we are going to take the results of the validation of the static list control and include it in this rule. Now here's the advantage of doing that the way we are going to be doing it here. First, we are taking the cumulative results of each of the validations for the individual controls and then adding them to the save button. we are not writing individual rules to validate each of these individual fields all in the save button. Instead, we're taking the individual rules and then taking the results of that and including them in the save button. So in this case, the result is the caption controls are hidden or visible. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to tell the form, keep the save button disabled if any one of these has their hidden attribute set to false. So I click on save and go to the disabled rule already in place and click before the inner closing bracket, and I type in cap, and this brings up all the controls that are named cap. And there it is, the cap static list value. And here are the two attributes called resolvable disabled and resolvable hidden. If you do not see these two attributes, you will have to then uncheck the show best matches checkbox, and then you'll be able to see these two attributes. So I'm going to take the hidden attribute of the cap static list caption control, or label control rather, and include it in this rule. And save my changes. Close out the current version. Preview. I see I have an error, and that's because I forgot to add a comma after the last item on that list. So I'm going to add a comma and I'm going to step out. Okay, good. So no errors. So save and preview. Okay, the form button is disabled, but will it remain disabled if we still have an invalid selection in the static list control? Let's test that out. So I'm going to put in a valid data here, Andy. Again, valid data in here. And yes, this time the button still remains disabled because one of the captions of the validation results of the static list control is still visible. So let's make this go away and see what happens. That's great. Now we have the save button enabled and the form is ready to be submitted for further processing. So reversing this, the save button is disabled once more, which means that all our cumulative rules of validating each of the fields are working and controlling the disabled attribute of the form submit button. So this is good. The one last piece that is remaining is we never really looked closer at the variable that actually records the selected value. Earlier in the video, we spoke about the var list static selected variable, but we did not see this in action. So for that, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to click on the save button and go to the events and edit a rule that's already in place. Again, please note that this rule was built in the part 1 video, and I again suggest that you watch that video to see the context around the concat function that was covered in that part 1 video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to include the selected value so that it can be displayed when the form submit button is clicked. So I'm going to put in comma, going to give it a few spaces and then say, I enjoy working with colon space comma and include the var list static selected variable. Okay, so we have that. Close, save. Again, entering some valid information. So I hit the save button. So good. I see I enjoy working with and the selection UiPath RPA reflected here. If I go back and change it to something different, that value has changed. So this is how the selected value works, because it is bound to the selected value binding property of the static list control. That is all for this video. If you liked this video and learned something from it, please like and subscribe to my channel. So before I conclude this video, I would like to share that my course on Udemy on Advanced Enterprise RPA has been rated highly on course marks, and it is one of the top 20% of almost 95,000 courses that they have listed on course marks. And if you like the content that I'm publishing to my channel, I would recommend that you check this course out, and I hope that you learn and advance your knowledge in UiPath RPA and robotic process automation in general. Thank you, and I'll talk to you soon.